So I want to talk about American democracy. There's no question that it's in crisis. The presence of uninvited federal troops in our cities calls to mind images of violent intergovernmental conflict, and cuts to our public agencies have been indiscriminate, even by the standards of past Republican administrations. All this is new and unprecedented, but it should also be familiar because Republican officials in the states have promised to do similar things for decades. For decades, politicians in red states have run against large, diverse cities within their own borders, alleging corruption and voter fraud by officials therein, and some have even passed policies that criminalize routine get-out-the-vote operations. But crucially, Republicans in the states in the past have stopped just short of sending in the state police. Likewise, Republican state officials have run against the administrative state and pledged to drain the swamp long before Trump, although crucially again, few carried out these promises fully. Therefore, in order to understand how we got to the political present, we have to take stock of what happened in the states. This is the subject of my forthcoming book, a series of feet-on-the-ground ethnographic case studies that showcase red state and blue state officials and their attempts to remake state government. So today I'm going to be talking about the red state officials. So the story that we know about state politics is one of Republican gains. From the 1990s, when Republicans controlled all three branches of government in just 3 states, to 23 state governments today. But the policy implications of this trend have been surprisingly murky. In some policy domains, for instance, reproductive rights or immigration enforcement, policy in red states has undeniably shifted to the right. We've all seen that. However, the trend in other policy domains has been towards the status quo, a policy or a phenomenon that political scientists sometimes refer to as the missing policy revolution in red states. Voting rights and public health care, two topics that are at the heart of my book, are a case in point. So I know that we've all heard a lot about photo ID laws and other contrivances by Republicans to restrict the vote legislatively, and of course these do matter. At the same time, it's the little appreciated fact about American elections that they're administered by county officials rather than states, which means that in most cases, cities in red states get to elect the officials who oversee their own elections. And if you've spent any time talking to these officials, you come to realize that although things like voter ID laws matter, they can potentially matter much less than the hundreds of administrative innovations that dedicated officials can adopt to expand access to the franchise. And the data actually bears this out. So due to the coordinated efforts of county officials, professional associations, get-out-the-vote operations, civil rights attorneys, some red state cities are at the forefront of election administration. For instance, St. Louis, which evinces higher rates of voter turnout than many blue state cities like New York, Chicago, or for that matter, Providence. Likewise, we've all heard lots about Republican efforts to restrict expansion of Medicaid to low-income individuals, so-called Obamacare. But we hear much less about less politicized federal waivers, which allow states to expand access to public health care in other ways, and which track much less closely to Republican control of state government. For instance, this waiver, which expands public health care to pregnant people regardless of immigration status. And the sum total of these less politicized waivers are per capita public health care expenditures in many red states, for instance, Missouri, Indiana, or Alaska, that are actually higher than in many blue states, for instance, Virginia, New Jersey, or Hawaii. Understanding these patterns requires us to appreciate the classical sociological insight that people's behavior makes sense only in organizational cultural context. This means that we have to look past media caricatures of conservatism, which, in the words of one recent review, often vacillate between, on the one hand, stories about kind of conspiracies of the all-powerful, and on the other hand, a kind of confederacy of dunces. Rather, we have to look carefully at red state officials' contextual incentives for policy action and inaction. Along these lines, my book shows that these incentives are extraordinarily complex and often confront officials with what the book terms administrative guardrails, which to date have incentivized policy talk over policy action. So with regards to voting rights, for instance, Republican photo ID laws and, frankly, racist dispersion of illegal voting in our cities were undeniably good red state politics. But to actually interfere with the work of election officials would have been another step altogether, for instance, bringing conflict with highly popular county clerks' professional associations, and thereby complicating routine electioneering, even in Republican areas. Likewise, public opposition to Obamacare no doubt rallied the Republican base, but to seriously cut back on public health in the states and public health programs more generally would have disrupted the fragile fiscal cross-subsidies that maintained rural hospitals and were then key to Republicans' rural base. Understanding how we got to the present requires us to take advantage of these administrative guardrails, particularly if we want to understand something like MAGA's propensity for extremism and democratic backsliding. Because what I've told you might otherwise sound like a good news story, although we can clearly see in retrospect that the guardrails in state and county government allowed Republicans in the state to articulate visions of an anti-democratic and extreme legal order that was for the moment decoupled from street-level consequences in a lot of cases, but has since then evidently migrated its way to the White House, where it informs federal policy today. But crucially, it's these same administrative guardrails and the state and county officials who comprise them, which may ultimately serve on the last check and the ultimate check on Republicans' efforts to remake our political system. Thank you.